And so I go, like, probably gonna go break out like the last panel. I'm gonna just stand down tonight.
Back, land back, land back, land back. Okay, so we got that chant going. Thank you to Karina here. So I am really, hey, I'm Komaleo. So my name is Brittani Orona. I am a member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe. I am also an assistant professor of American Indian Studies at San Diego State University. And I'm also proud to serve as the board secretary for Save California Salmon, an organization that I've been honored to be a part of for the last few years. So it's really great to see everybody here for this conference. It's a really, really important conference that we are coming together to talk through some of these issues around land back. So I'm also very pleased to be the moderator for panel number 2, Land Grab Universities, the California Context. And we have a great and awesome group of speakers here to talk to you about the nature of land granting institutions in California, how they have perpetuated native land loss through the university and academic system, and then the ways in which all of our panelists are working towards land back in these institutions. So I am going to let the panelists introduce themselves and to tell us about your work with universities and land back. And then we'll also get into a few preset questions. But then after that, we will have a Q&A. And I know this group is very enthusiastic and excited to have questions and answers for our panelists. And it's such great energy here, and I'm really happy and glad to be here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it down.
Hetanayam Winameki, Nikiam Sahilo, Niki Mechoopda, Brittani, Nihai Environmental Director for the Mechoopda Indian Tribe at Chico Rancheria. So good day, y'all. My name's Hilo. My people are the Mechoopda, and I'm very happy to be here today with all y'all. And I'm the Environmental Director for my tribe.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Rachel McBride Pretorius. I am the Director of Tribal Relations at Chico State. I am Yurok, and I'm glad to be home. And I thank the Wiyot people for allowing us to be here, and it feels good to be home.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Phenocia Bauerle. I am the Director of Native American Student Development at UC Berkeley. I also sit on the UC System-Wide President's Native American Advisory Council. I am Apsalika or Crow from Montana, so I also appreciate the Wiyot people welcoming us onto their land and acknowledge I'm also a visitor here. Thank you.
Oh, hello, everyone. I'm Adam Canter, Natural Resource Director for the Wiyot Tribe. For about a decade, I'm a botanist and ethnobotanist, and that's about a blip of time in the spectrum of time immemorial. So I'm happy to be here today, this group.
So to start it off a little bit, could you tell us about your work with universities and land back, and then how your current work is related to the land back movement, as well as how you've partnered with faculty, university administrators, and tribes in the land back movement? So that's a lot of questions, and I'm happy to repeat them. But I think generally just to understand your work at this university, institutional, or tribal level.
So since time immemorial, the Mechoopda Indian tribe has stewarded, occupied, and managed the lands on Eskinum Shoei Otakamshewi, and the Siwotim in what is now Butte and Glenn counties. So that would be the Big Chico Creek watershed, Butte Creek watershed, and the Sacramento River. Our ancestral lands our ancestral lands include what is now Chico State University, which also includes our former rancheria. Our former rancheria, about 20 acres in whole, is now partially the South Campus of Chico State during the era of termination in the 1960s. The federal government terminated our federal recognition and then sold half of our reservation to the Chico State and the other half to the city of Chico. Due to this shared history of our village sites being on campus and former rancheria occupying a part of campus, we have a very close relationship with Chico State University due to a largely new administration with President Gail Hutchinson a few years ago. And the development, I believe it's the first Office of Tribal Relations within the CSU system when it was created. Within the president's office, yes. So a couple years ago or so, the Chico State University was wishing to work with their auxiliary enterprise, Chico State Enterprises, to give back the Butte Creek Nature Preserve, which has been managed by the Chico State Enterprise, formerly known as CSU Chico Research Foundation, for the last 20 or so years. And what was thought to be an easy thing, the Chico State has 100 acres of our sacred cultural lands. They want to give it back to the tribe. It should be easy. It wasn't. It actually needed to go through the state legislature. We had to change California state law to make it legal for the university to give us her land back. Big thanks to Assemblyman James Gallagher for pushing that through. State of California Assemblyman James Gallagher was instrumental in changing the law. What was it? AB 379 was the law. And the previous law strictly prohibited tribes from being eligible for managing state conservation lands and taking state conservation loans through the WCB, the Wildlife Conservation Board. And I'll let my colleague here, Rachel, talk to the rest of that.
So as Hilo mentioned, so I came to campus and my position is one of the first in the CSU system to be located in the office of the president. Our president really wanted to acknowledge government to government relationships. So when I stepped on campus 5 years ago and was approached like, hey, have you ever thought about giving land back to tribes? And I'm like, well, yes, like, how do we do this, right? And so we started having conversations with the director of the ecological reserves and preserves. And as Hilo mentioned, thought it would be this really great, easy process, sign a few documents, we're done. And I think after our first meeting where we literally thought this was going to happen because we could, from what our interpretation of regulatory codes were, we could do this, right? We could transfer to tribes. And when we were told within the first 5 minutes of the meeting that we have already used these regulatory codes to not transfer to tribes, we knew that this was going to be a process and the fight was on, right? And so we started the process. Mechoopda was instrumental. They took the lead. As you know, we're public entity. So we were in the process to educate along the way people and partners, supporters, or anyone who may have thought this wasn't a good idea. In the end, the legislation did get passed, and literally all we wanted to do is to have tribes put into this legislation to be able to transfer. AB 379, we thought it was a done deal. And I will say, never underestimate the power of one person that has a lot of fear or a lot of, is not knowledgeable about tribes, right? In the 11th hour, the legislation got taken off consent because of one letter that was written in opposition by a public nonprofit. So then again, the fight was on. So what we thought, we were being, really careful with our timeline of 6 months through a bureaucratic process of the CSU or Chico State Enterprises turned into 4 years of long-going conversations and battles. But the ultimate outcome is the property was transferred in September of this past fall. And so that was huge. And part of the reasons why we want to have these conversations is so that you all are very aware and know that these laws are changing, because another project that we are working on is transferring lands to Susanville Indian Rancheria, which was a different process. It's called Eagle Lake up in Susanville. So we went and we're like, okay, so this is a little different process. We had to put it out for RFP. And as people mentioned earlier, taking the administrative burden away from these processes will be huge and should be our next priorities. So they submitted an RFP, they were chosen. So we start working. So this one we're thinking, well, we know that we are already having a legislative fix with this state legislative fix with Mechoopda. And so we're like, but this one shouldn't be a problem because it's federal land, it's BLM. So we go up to Susanville. I think we have every single person that you can imagine from BLM, from the tribe, and from Chico State represented in this room. We leave, me being so optimistic and especially from our previous conversations with other state entities, as we're leaving, I'm like, so we're clear, this is the next steps and we are transferring this land. Yes, we get back, people have a lot more, they are a lot braver behind a computer. So we start getting some emails and realize, wow, we're not only going to not get this done, but we need now a congressional fix to a bill to be able to transfer this land. So Susanville has stepped up. They have been pushing this bill, and I will say it went into effect in January to where now we can transfer BLM lands to federally recognized tribes, which we couldn't do anything about that, but at that point, at that federal level, but Susanville was able to get that bill fixed and passed. And so we are now meeting with BLM. We will be the first, and they are saying, well, we don't know the process. I'm like, well, sure you do, because you've transferred to nonprofits and other governmental agencies. There's no difference. Tribes are now included in those categories. You do know the process. So we are in the process of doing that, and we are hopeful that that will be done in May or June, and we will be transferring that land back to Susanville. So there, at this point, at any time anyone has any conversations around land, I feel like I have the same thought as Kacha, I'm like, give it back. And at this point, we know how to do that, whether it's state, federal lands. If it's public lands, we need to figure out how to give it back.
So I think my involvement with the Landback movement, but also just that energy and effort is a little, we're not to the active stage yet at UC, but I think in my capacity as an advisory to administrators, have been working to get the UC on board to actually just have conversations and think about it, because we began that in the fall of 2020 when we hosted a 2-day convening around the UC land grab, and just educating people to the extent that land had been taken from California Native tribes, but also all over the country to fund land grant institutions, which generally people think land grant are great because democracy for all and education for all, and actually not understanding where those like very, very white supremacist colonial roots to this idea of free education in this country, and education for who at whose expense. So we convened the first day was a panel that brought the authors of a major project, probably many of you are familiar with, that was the UC Land Grab U was the project that was Tristan Atone, who is a journalist, and then Dr. Bobby Lee, who is a historian. And if you aren't familiar with it, if you Google it, it's a really, really in-depth, amazing project that lets you trace all of the land grant universities in this country. There's an interactive map, and you see exactly what land was taken from which tribes, how much it was sold for, and which university profited from it. So it was an amazing educational project that we really wanted to amplify, and the UC being one of the great offenders and participants of this. And since I am at UC Berkeley, which is the UC's flagship institution, we have a big burden to bear in realizing that history, recognizing it, and then moving forward to look at what we can do to rectify might be a strong word, but to address those issues and be better partners to Native tribes, particularly in California, where we've damaged tribes in so many ways. So I think that's how I come to these issues. Since then, it's been working on having conversations about also how the system can get on board. Like the UC Berkeley's one piece, but there's a lot of other campuses that need to also get on board. And a lot of things don't move unless the president says they should move. So Kacha sits on the advisory committee, as well as others from the UC system and elsewhere. And we really are trying to have the conversations that get people to start thinking about. I put some of these, so I don't take up too much time. I printed just a few of these. This is the executive summary of the convening we had. The second day, Brittani was able to be a participant on our panels, but it was an interactive, more interactive kind of conversation about what can we do, and really trying to pull from all the participants. So there's a series of recommendations that beyond just like physically giving land back in a, I think a particular way people think about it reminds me of, many of you may remember there's an episode of Reservation Dogs that starts out with a land back conversation in a car. And I think that's like sort of where we are in higher ed and thinking about land back in some ways. Like, what do you mean? Like, an unnamed administrator confided that some people think it's like literally like they want them to give back Sproul Plaza, like where everyone walks. And it's like, that's okay. We've got to start like with real basic conversations about ways that we can think about what land do we have. I mean, the UCs have a vast amount of land that they're not using. And but it's like it is like the ancestors that UC Berkeley holds a ridiculous number of for so many years, but held on to because they don't know what they don't know, and they might want to learn something from it before. And it's like, you've had your 150 years. It's time, like let's let it go back to places. So I think that's where I come at this. And yeah, I will pass it on.
Well, thanks. Yeah, so the Wiyot's relationship with the university and land return. Kacha started to tell the story about the Gookdeaton Forest earlier, which we know today is the Jacoby Creek Forest. It's an amazing forest, one of the main tributaries here, the Wiggy and Humboldt Bay, in the Wiyot's ancestral land, which I'll thank Chairman Hernandez for letting me be up here to speak about this today in his opening earlier. And so a couple of years back, the university somehow got this land given to them using state grant funds without ever asking the tribe if they had any interest in, much less co-management and anything about the property. And I think that was about the time I met Kacha. And as part of the recently formed Jacoby Creek Forest Advisory Committee, all the university folks are sitting up here at the table like we're sitting at now, and the tribe's kind of sitting, back where you guys are. And I think we had to remind them that, tribes are sovereign nations. They're at the same level with the federal government, never ceded their rights. And, why are we talking about, co-management? Why are we not talking about land return? Is what Kacha says. And, it threw a bunch of folks kind of just in a tizzy and sort of sent the whole advisory committee kind of apart. And then the pandemic happened, which I think was a convenient excuse for the university to not reconvene the committee, which we still have not had a committee meeting since the pandemic. And we continue to ask to this day. And, that kind of led to a couple of years right around the same time. The Wiyots were huge leaders in protecting the sacred site of Wiyot, which is a Bear River Ridge from an industrial energy project, which we know industrial energy projects have not had a good history and legacy, in impacting salmon and tribal species. And folks in the community started to say, well, the Wiyot tribe, they don't care about climate change. And we're like, what are you talking about? The tribes are the original stewards. They've been adapting to climate change since time immemorial. And around about that time, Dr. Laurie Richmond here at Cal Poly invited us to be part of the new Sea Level Rise initiative. And I thought this is the opportunity, to show in the public light that the tribe really does care about climate resilience and climate change. And that led to a series of successful collaborations and grant proposals until one day we saw this environmental justice posting for a new funding opportunity through the Ocean Protection Council through Prop 1, and Secretary Crowfoot talked about this earlier today. It's supposed to have a water quality nexus and benefit. And so we all know that returning land to tribes is the best thing you can do to protect water quality. And asked the funders if they would consider using the funds for a land return project. And they sat there and they kind of thought about it, and they were like, why not? And that kind of led us down the road to crafting a proposal to try to purchase a property that, if any environmental professionals, in this room thinking about, the way to really know the land is to be on the land and to know the critters and the flora and the species that are there. And then, the places that are really, fragile and need to be protected because, coupled with the climate crisis is the biodiversity crisis, and they're intertwined. And so we have to think of addressing those both, equally. And through that process, I learned a lot about tribal sovereignty and, the administrative burden that tribes have to take on funding and to collaborate. The tribes have a lot of high indirect costs, and universities, nonprofits, see this as an opportunity to collaborate, and sometimes out of their own interests, get funds, I don't want to say using tribes, but working with tribes to have more competitive access to funding and grant funds. And so we thought, well, maybe the university is our solution to dealing with high administrative costs, and maybe they should act as a physical sponsor. And the grant went down the line. We were high up in the selection process, and we're really excited to hear that we got funding. And the grant had been separated. Part was going to go to the university and part was going to go to the tribe. For the university was going to manage the purchase, so indirect costs wouldn't be applied. And luckily, thanks to great leadership in the tribe, we saw that this would have been a huge violation to tribal sovereignty, that it would have led to another situation like what happened with Jacoby Creek, where now the tribe is potentially having to negotiate with the university to try to get land back. Meanwhile, the tribe, the university is benefiting from the funding opportunity. But long story short, we talked to the state, indirect costs were not applied, and the tribe was able to purchase the property using the grant funds, which was really awesome. There's a lot to be talked about, deed restrictions. We're really excited about the deed on this property because we really had the state kind of force them to think outside the box. And one of the deed restrictions on the property, I'm going to pull it up right now because I don't know if this is a first, but I want to get it right, is the burden property is restricted and shall exclusively be used for Wiyot ecocultural restoration in the deed restrictions. And so Secretary Crowfoot also talked about ecocultural restoration and how through ecological restoration involving tribes, you're also restoring the culture. And I think that can really expand the activities that can happen on the property from, just, your traditional, box of conservation, which excludes tribes from, potentially building plank houses or other cultural, restoration, installations on properties. So we're excited about that. And we also got them to allow a pathway to move the property from fee into trust, which we thought was going to be an issue because of the use of state funds. And so we hope moving forward that this will help out other tribes as a precedent. for working with the state to get land back. So you can still uphold sovereignty and protect these important places for future generations.
Thank you so much for those really wonderful answers. And something that actually, Adam, when you were talking, that I was thinking about, and I think it's a really great question from the last panel as well, is these kind of limitations that are placed upon tribes and also in the university setting for land return and like these deed restrictions that you're talking about and all these issues that come up. In the next panel, we'll talk about land trusts, which are also a very interesting part of land return. So I was just hoping to hear from the rest of the panelists about these kind of restrictions that you see and limitations that you see at the university level, especially as we're talking about like cross coordination too with the state and federal government.
Thank you. So when we're talking about land back, I thank you for posing that question, because it really is an important question. What is land back? Because Chico State, through Chico State Enterprises, gave that land to us. However, it has conservation easements and deed restrictions through the WCB to where essentially we have the right to manage the land. But if we don't follow X, Y, and Z, it can always be returned to the state of California. So we don't actually in practice 100% own it. And those deed restrictions are due to why the land was purchased in the first place back late, probably 1999 or 2002. So a little history about Butte Creek. It has the largest self-sustaining spring run Chinook salmon run in the state of California. And this vital salmon run is imperiled. There's a series of PG&E dams in the foothills of the creek, and the spring run salmon aren't able to get to colder holding waters in the lower mountain upper foothill region. They're stuck in the lower foothill canyon valley region where water temperatures, life history of spring run Chinook salmon, as we probably most know, they used to be able to take advantage of the spring floods, come up during spring, hold during summer, and then spawn in fall. Now they're holding in the valley where water temperatures are in 80 degrees Fahrenheit, much, much warmer than their 50 degrees to 40 degrees Fahrenheit needs are. So the land was purchased through WCB 2002-ish for spring run Chinook salmon. So the deed restrictions involve managing the land for that, and then also for the riparian ecosystem there. The past 150 years, the land was gold dredged and gold mined. So they took the top 10 to 15 of topsoil, put it through a gold dredger, spit out the back. And when they needed to gold mine a different section of the canyon, they would just reroute the creek to the other side. ... We're here today. But these deed restrictions can be restricted to our own cultural use. For example, one of the just blanket laws or regulations, it'd probably be more fit to say regulations or policies, is nothing can be removed from the WCB lands. So if we're wanting to use the lands for our own ecocultural purposes, like gathering basket material or gathering medicine, yerba santa, willow, etc., basket sedge, those deed restrictions can prevent us from wanting, if we're doing what we wanted to do with the first place with the land.
So the other land transfer that we're working on, the federal one, and by the way, that legislative change was through the Recreation and Public Purposes Act, which was changed and went into effect in January. But not only the deed restrictions and everything for the state transfer, but the federal one, there's this requirement for educational purposes. And naively, we're like, well, Susanville can just use what Chico State Enterprises has. And for educational and cultural purposes, everyone was on the same board, same page, and we get the document. And you gotta love the academy, right? They took a 6-page response or document, what's called a plan of development, and turned it into the 90-page like research proposal, right? So now we're sitting here and this is all happening right now. And so now we're like, okay, now we need to move through this process. And so Susanville is working on that. And so they're going to have to create this plan of development. But I will say, we are at the table advocating for the minimal requirements to get it approved so that Susanville has as much flexibility to do what they need. So we are in process of trying to do that plan of development right now with them, but it doesn't matter regardless if it's a patent, a lease, an easement, a deed, whatever it is, there's all these requirements and restrictions. And so that's why I say transfer, because the tribes are stewarding the land, but they don't own it. They can't fully do what they want on it yet. Those are the next steps, right?
Yeah, I think some of the restrictions or challenges in terms of beginning to think about this at the university level is, I think, is informed by some of the things that you folks have shared already. But I think it is just getting to understand why Landback, I mean, I think is at the center of some of this, that Chico State is a model, that they have a Office of Government Relations within the president's office that actually recognizes tribes as sovereign government, where I think a lot of institutions, at least particularly the UC, I can speak for, tend to approach consultation and government to government relations only in really specific cases, as like we've checked the box and it's compliance, not really thinking about tribes as governments and as sovereign nations that need to be discussed, and that you're coming from different places. So I think hearing these challenges around the deed limitations is also like, we need to, if the UCs or institutions are going to think about giving land back, which they should, it's also, we need to help encourage, I think some of my job and my colleagues' jobs within the institutions are to shift the needle from just thinking about it as compliance, as to thinking about it as like, this is ethics. This is not, we should not be saying, well, we can't take anything off of it because, because it doesn't recognize that this actually was land taken from, and that there's an understanding of how to be in relation with that land. And I mean, I'm staying at the Blue Lake Hotel, and Blue Lake Casino Hotel, and I was really moved. There's something on the wall that just talks about the trees being planted to, get to to reduce climate change. And it's like, that's not something you see in a Marriott, because isn't within the values of that social culture that has been created there. And I think in a very annoying academic way, that is like our responsibility within the institutions of higher ed, because academics will take a very simple thing and turn it into a research project of their own, because that's how we think of knowledge production within institutions of higher education. And a lot of folks talk about like the decolonizing project. I don't want to get into that because I think these are colonial institutions. What does that mean? But if we can work, I think the challenges come with indigenizing ways of thinking and trying to get institutions to think about Indigenous perspective as on the same level as Western knowledge. So I think challenges are the infrastructure, even having a government to government relationship, having people who understand that. I was just telling before we started, like, it's Chico State's great. They have a California Indian working with California Indians on government to government relations that all California institutions should have, not pulling in somebody who you think knows how to be nice with those tribes. So I think that's one, understanding what sovereignty is, understanding what consultation is. All of those pieces are really integral to shifting how we have these conversations about land back, because otherwise the bureaucracy kills us and the minutia kills us. And like, you have to get it. I mean, we need those things in the deeds, but also what is the spirit of why we're doing this? Shouldn't be so much in the, because we can prove we need it, or because we can prove we do a better job. It's like, no, you took this, now you didn't do well with this, like give someone else a chance. I think those are the challenges in institutions of higher ed that I'm seeing.
Well, maybe like grant applications, crafting deed restrictions is more of a wordsmithing exercise that we can branch out into creative writing. And in the instance of Marashawak, with the Wiyot tribe, rather than kind of thinking of restrictions, in this case, putting opportunities into the deed restrictions, like the opportunity for ecocultural restoration and water quality monitoring and biological monitoring, and really taking maybe the precedent of some of the more progressive land return projects that are happening, like Marashawak, and pushing that a little bit further with that.
Thank you so much. I have so many more questions, but I don't want to take up the space here. I want you all in the audience to be able to ask questions too. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand and I will come to you. So I saw you go first.
Hi, so this is a little off topic, but still on topic. What about golf courses? And Landback in those situations, because golf courses be taking up like all the good land. So, yeah, that's my question.
So if anybody has a response to that.
Yeah, I can ramble on a wee bit. I don't know if it'll address your question, but funny enough, where I'm from, there's something called Bidwell Park, one of the largest city-owned parks in all the United States. And right in the middle of Upper Bidwell Park is a giant golf course. And on Big Chico Creek in the early 1900s, they actually built a diversion canal to remove water from Big Chico Creek to divert it to something called Horseshoe Lake today. It's a man-made lake. And that was to act as a reservoir back in the mid-century to give water to the golf course. And currently we're in the process of removing some of that fish passage, human-made structures in Big Chico Creek for a salmon restoration project. But yeah, golf courses.
We don't own any, but if we did, I would say give it back. Like that would be the main takeaway, but I don't have any.
Actually, to riff on that a little bit with the golf courses, I was wondering actually about partnerships between private entities and like these, we've talked a lot about public and the state and federal, but I'm curious if you've had experience with the private entities attempting to give land back to or give land to the university and then goes to tribes, and how that kind of interacts with the work that you do.
Going through these processes, we were involved with a lot of different entities. I will say a little bit off, but I'll come back to that. One of the biggest takeaways I would say for universities going through this process is to come to the table first and figure out how you're going to have a truly meaningful relationship with tribal partners, because you all need to be on the same page, because the process is going to take you places that you never thought you would be. I will say for both of these projects, when it came to the actual transfers, Santa Ynez Band of Chumash, like they were huge partners with Mechoopda to help get legislation passed. And you're going to need that. If we would have been at the table on our own, we would have been stopped at the legislative process in both situations, right? Because we wouldn't have been able to push that legislation, whereas the tribes have the power to do that. And working with other tribes is huge. So I would say the partnerships are key. When it comes to the private entities, I know that there has been land donations to universities, and we're having the same conversations. What does that look like? There was a land donation to our reserves. It was in the works prior to this. There were conversations of why not Mechoopda? But when it comes to private entities, they have the right to do what they want, I guess, with their land, which is ironic that I'm even saying that, right? So there wasn't a way, but what our reserves were able to do is, okay, well, we're going to do this because we don't want it given to anyone else, but we're going to give Mechoopda the voice of this land. But we're lucky to have that kind of relationship and partnership with Mechoopda. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. So expanding on that, that parcel is about 4,000 acres that was gifted from a private landowner to Chico State Enterprises in their nature reserves. And it's that land has, it's a very important part of our ecocultural landscape. I don't want to say too much, but with the relationship that we have with Chico State, as soon as they got the land, the very first people to step foot on it was us. They said, we got this land. We'd love for you to be the first people to walk on it. We'll give you a Kubota, it's like a quad, and just go on it and identify all the things you want to identify and look for all the things you want to look for, and tell us what areas are the most important and that should be restricted from the public or students from visiting. And they even asked us, what should we name this? What should we name this parcel? And we went ahead and told them it should be called Chakawiotignona, which means the place with the blue oaks where many hollow draws have their origin. And we are currently assisting the Chico State Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve to create a management plan for that, incorporating cultural fire and cultural gathering as keystone pieces of land management.
This just made me think about private folks offering to give land back. And one thing that we ought to have experienced being here on the Wiggy is folks will offer land that's right on the fringes of the bay, which is awesome, but areas that might be former industrial sites are very vulnerable to sea level rise. And one of the requirements when the tribe is going through a land transaction is to do an environmental site assessment to make sure that tribes aren't being given a liability or being kind of pushed on a property that someone's trying to get rid of for a reason. And those environmental site assessments, the phase ones or phase two, which takes that to even look at potential chemical contaminants in soil and whatnot, those cost money. And that was a situation where the university actually sort of helped with funding that aspect through their part of the OPC grant funding. But at the same time, it put the tribe on the university schedule to get that a survey done. So story there.
Okay, lots of hands went up. So I'm gonna just start and then go back.
I wonder if you could talk about the relationship with the UC Natural Reserve System, the idea of co-management, and how does co-management fit in with scientific research?
Sure. Yeah, well, I will say that this project that I mentioned, the UC Land Grab project, did really engage UC A&R, the Agricultural Natural Resources Group, which is its own entity. It's like its own, it's not a campus, but it's its own entity like other campuses for the UC. So they have a working group that I've been part of when I have the time to go, really trying to think through, and they're really lovely people. I think one of the things that's difficult is that they're real scientists, like real sciencey scientists, and really nice, but it's really hard to, this is why I think I'm harping on these sort of like theoretical challenges, because just the way people think is really hard. I think Beth Rose Middleton, who was part of that Karina mentioned earlier at Davis, she was a panelist on this project, and she's been also trying to push folks to think about ways that, whether it's co-management or whether, if we look at what could be given to tribes for stewardship and whatever they want to use it for. But I think that inherently there's this concern for the loss of potential research or the loss of potential knowledge, which I see that in higher ed all the time. I mean, that's why I say decolonization for a colonial project is maybe more than we want to take on, rather than just shifting the conversation, because I think institutions like this were built to like hoard knowledge and this is ours and this is ours to figure out what we want to do with. And so I think that there are conversations going on, but it's not widespread enough to really move the needle. Folks were really interested in these conversations, but there's also a lot of fear of what you don't know. So especially with, I feel like I can comfortably speak to the folks in this room. And I'll pretend that we're not on Zoom. But I think, there's a lot of, when you're dealing with non-native people or people who haven't worked with native folks often, I think there's a big fear of like deciding that something's that is based in for good reason, deciding to do something that is right in your mind, but may not be right for the folks who should be at the table. But there's also this like, we don't know who the right folks to get at the table are. And I think that's part of how I'm trying to create opportunities. In 2017, we hosted a tribal forum at UC Berkeley, which was the first time the institution in over 140 years had invited tribes to come and just talk about what partnership might look like, which was astounding. But I think it's things like that have to happen before you can actually move into like, who gets to be at those tables also to talk about how you do co-management, co-stewardship. So I think we've been encouraging A&R to work with also faculty and researchers on campuses who have partnerships already, like the Crew Collaborative, things like that, that are successful and have a track record. And how did you get here? And take those learnings to understand how they might start to grow, because they're long processes. I mean, not just giving land back, but creating partnerships that people can trust each other. And I think I'm seeing that in certain little pockets across the system. But A&R, they're working on it. It's just science doesn't always. It's its own world of thinking, and I think that's part of why we need to think about how we transform the way scientists think, because we see that with anthropology, right? It's the same kind of deal of like, people agree now things are pretty messy, and that was maybe not the way to go about things, but at the time it seemed like that was the way. And so yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or if there's follow-up, but
Hi, I live in Arcata and I don't own land to give back, but am concerned about the community and the plans that have come forth on something like the Gateway Plan, where they want to build a lot of buildings in former industrial areas close to the bay and maybe subject to sea level rise. And I have asked from the very beginning, have the Wiyot people been, brought to the table and talked to about what the city is planning or proposing? And so I just want to know if anybody has any information on that, because I've never really gotten a decent answer.
I was like, that's an excellent question for our tribal historic preservation officer, Ted Hernandez. But I will say, as natural resources director, which folks say we should change to natural relatives department. Let's see. I have not been contacted about the Arcata Gateway project. No.
Okay.
So I have to agree with that. There's not been really much talk on it. But if we can get in contact with the city of Arcadia, like I say, we will throw it out there. If Arcadia wants to talk to us, we're willing to talk because we do want land back. We want all of our land back, but we have to start slow. So that's where we're at.
So within the university, the decision-making processes aren't always totally transparent. And I was wondering, who are the people that decide like, yes, we want to move towards land back with like, say, a given property that we have or own? And who are the people that can stop that from happening? I know there's like deans and tenured professors and students, and I'm wondering who does get invited to that table, or what even is that table?
Well, that's a very political question. So what I will say is that at Chico State, we've been able to do things a little differently the last 5 years, and I'm going to only speak from my experience being on campus for those 5 years. Strategically, tribal relations was put in the office of the president to work with the president, and that is my direct supervisor. And ultimately, in a CSU system, the president has the authority on the campus. We have auxiliaries, as you've heard Hilo mention, Chico State Enterprises, which is our research foundation arm. They have a board of directors. The president sits on that board of directors, along with other university representatives. So ultimately, it's the president that's who makes the decisions. If it's land under the auxiliary, it's the board of directors. And for the people in the right spaces, that's what I was talking about with partnerships, knowing who has access to information about what are the land holdings. I think a lot of people don't even know what land the CSUs and UCs hold, right? So building relationships, but having people in positions that can say, wait a second, I'm in this meeting, it may be a random meeting, but I want to have a further conversation about this. And then having the infrastructure within the university, like an Office of Tribal Relations, that really truly does acknowledge our tribal partners as sovereign nations. And we want that government to government, that tribal consultation.
I was gonna make a quick comment about I got staff watching Zoom right now. So I believe we are in talks with Arcadia for the last year with this project now. So we are constantly talking to them is what my staff, because I have a Dishkama, which is our housing department. They're working with the city of Arcadia right now.
If you don't mind. Hope. Hello? No. Yeah, maybe they're warning to be like, don't say anything political. But to answer your question from earlier, to expand on it, from my personal experience, I wouldn't say that you should be looking inside the university for backlash for giving land back. I'd say you should be looking at conservation nonprofit organizations in your area that stop tribes from getting land back. There's deep-seated ideas of what conservation is, and some of these nonprofits might have the idea that only members of the dominant cultural group, Anglo-Americans, have the expertise and knowledge to manage these lands, and only they can fix what was destroyed by through colonization. So yeah, I just don't have a preconceived notions, but like, oh, these are local conservation nonprofits, they should be really happy. But not everyone wants to share the sandbox. The more land that tribes get, the less land that nonprofits get.
And just to add really quickly, during both these processes, the majority of opposition and the struggles that we have had were outside of the university and Chico State Enterprises, not internal, they were external.
And just quickly to add on to that, I think it depends on where you're looking at. Within the UCs, I can speak to Berkeley, who decides. The chancellor will tell you the regents decide. It's not her decision. other people will tell you otherwise. So I think it's really how it's being strategic about how those conversations are unfolded and where the pressure is being applied. Because I don't think all the regions would be against, I mean, that's what they say about the ancestors too. Actually, we can't give things back. They belong to the regions. How messy is that? But that's the like the bureaucratic end of the line there where, okay, well, let's talk to the regions then. Like why not? But I think for some campuses within the UC system, the opposition is coming from within. People don't want to versus, there's a lot of pressure externally, but they're not applying the pressure in the right places. So.
And I just want to be mindful to reiterate, these were lands held within our Chico state enterprises, because if they were actually the state public lands, then it would be a whole different process with the Board of Trustees, Chancellor's Office and everything. So this was our auxiliary.
Yes, I would like to address the deeds and the clauses in the deeds that you mentioned earlier, working with some local property. I've been with a group that started in 1927, and they put their property into another name later on. And I heard that the California state has, passed a law where you could only have a reversion clause for 30 years. And then it goes away. So if you're going to be putting clauses to revert back, we lost our property because they had taken that clause away. And so that's something you want to be aware of.
I was wondering if you could speak to the pros and cons of putting land in fee or trust in different contexts. I work in the UROC territories, and it gets very complicated because it's a patchwork of both. And the rules that the trust land through the BIA puts out there.
It's going on in
there.
there.
Yeah.
Well, okay. When you put land into federal trust, which a lot of tribal folks think, like, why would you give land back to the federal government? After you finally got it back, but it opens up funding opportunities for environmental protection, agency funding through the Clean Water Act and general assistance programs, and other federal funding that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. But it also reduces the tax burden, which is a huge issue when you're talking about land back. But yeah, tough decisions to make. It's also a very long process. It's almost the burden of getting a land put into trust. They tell you it's multiple years and, attorneys and all that. So.
I essentially would have said what he said.
And then.
I'll stand so you can see me. I'm curious about conservation easements and the deed restrictions that you mentioned earlier. Is there a process to review those, as I know that they are permanent modifications to a deed? So has that been done before? And then I guess what are the implications for other conservation easements when we do change the stipulations of that?
So we are going to do a whole panel on the land trust and conservation easements, but this is a very good question for our tribal representatives up here. Sure.
So you might want to ask this question again at the later one. Unfortunately, I'm not a legal expert. I wish I was. I'm just a plant nerd. Uh, but I think that would be something really nice to look into. So the deed restrictions and conservation easement, they are tied to the deed of land in perpetuity. But if there was a manner of, let's say, this deed restriction that's highly restrictive made 20 some odd years ago before the state of California recognized the rights of California tribes to have engage in cultural practices and do cultural easements. That would be something, if it isn't already in place, I'd really like to see happen is if today the state of California is allowing ecocultural easements that include and respect cultural burning, gathering, and other TK practices as valid forms of land management and stewardship. Maybe the ones that were made 20 years ago can get changed.
So I am an alumni of this school, and I took one class in the Native American Studies department, and I feel like it really set my career on a trajectory of thinking about Landback, thanks to Kutcha. And I mean, just like while we're on this university subject, I feel like something that we haven't really talked about that much is like, why is this not more a part of curriculum? And like, what supports can there be to professors and lecturers to integrate these conversations into classes? And like, I think working for, you know, in the community for nonprofits, like knowing about these processes of Landback would be incredibly helpful into moving into the professional world. So just wondering if there's thoughts up there on integrating into curriculums and classes.
So we would love to have those conversations. And I think it just comes down to the different departments on campus and willing to change their curriculum, expand their curriculum. On our campus, we do have a minor, American Indian Studies minor. And so there are conversations about revamping that, moving towards the program and elevating it into a department, you know, at some point. Like that's my like long-term goal, pipe dream, right? But right now the conversations are looking at what courses exist on our campus. Where can we include topics like this? How do we change the curriculum in our AST program to make sure that people understand how to work with tribes, what work to do with tribes? We have a recreation and parks program degree, and they have a California lands management. So we're talking to them on like, we'd really like you to include this perspective. We'd really like you to talk about land management through a tribal perspective and lens. So just as of right now, it's conversations. And I will say our campus is open to those conversations. And it comes down to the individual faculty that are teaching those courses.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of, well, with everything, not selective. I agree with everything Rachel said. I think that again, it depends on which campuses you're on. Also in terms of, I mean, here, this campus is a little different than others, but I think it's really indicative of part of the problem. I mean, Kutch is great. And, but that it was a Native American Studies class that was like, opened your eyes to the possibilities. And I think that's the problem across the board in higher ed, is that Native issues are relegated to Native American Studies, which is not the way it's supposed to be. So I think that that is an inherent problem in education. And I don't think it's so, yes, classes looking at who can teach what, how to get departments resources to teach about things that they, because at Berkeley, there's a fear of people think they know everything, and so they don't want to admit that they don't know anything about a certain subject. So that's a specific problem, you know, when you're a top tier university. But I think also, so connecting people with people who can help teach those issues if they can't. But I think it's also, I mean, that speaks to the K-12 system as well. Like, how is it that students are only getting to college to learn about issues in that should be being taught because it's part of California history? And so like Nikki Myers, who's a friend and a colleague of mine, was like, California history is Native history. California Indian history is California history. And why is that not being taught? And I think that there's room to push for that in this state, as other states have done. I'm from Montana. There was the Indian Education for All Act, where you have to teach Native history in the state. Washington has done similar things. So I think just in like igniting activism, like this is an issue that could be also part of legislature in general education pieces, because I think leaving it at just the university level is also super elitist in thinking about how we do that. So.
I wanted to jump in there because I'm in a higher education institution too. So I wanted to put a plug in for an organization that has just started, the California Indian Scholars and Studies Association. Kacha is our head of that, but it's also along with other council of leaders, California Native scholars and leaders that have come together to build an organization that is looking at these higher education issues and teaching Native histories outside of both internal to American Indians and Native American Studies departments. Many of us are in those departments, and then outside of that as well. I also want to mention that I was hired through a push that came through the CSU system to hire California and Native American faculty into the CSU system. So that was like a big effort that came through activism from Native people. And I think just broadly and generally, if you look, you're here in Humboldt, you know the history and the very grounded local tribal history at Humboldt, Cal Poly Humboldt. It's one of the reasons I came here. We're very visible here, and there has been generations of people that have pushed forward that higher education standard at Humboldt that I think now, like under Kutch's leadership, other people who are in the audience now, we're seeing that push at the higher education level. So I just wanted to say that these things have been happening for generations, and they're continuing to happen both at the CSUs and the UCs. So I think that's pretty great. We have time for one more question. I see a hand coming up.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Tanya Garcia, and I'm a research engineer here on campus at HSU. My question has to do, where do you see the place of researchers, especially since y'all are involved in higher education? How can we support Landback? And I think inherently Western science is extractive, is intrusive. We're not looking at Native folk as partners, we're looking at them as something to study. And so one way that at my job one way we've done Landback is that we focus on energy resiliency. And so when we're saying we want to put solar and we're partnering with this tribe, we're saying, hey, state, can we use this funding to buy land, giving land back to the tribe and then putting solar on that? So just like one way I'm seeing, how can I be a part of Landback? At a higher education, how do you see researchers and that whole part of academia being in support rather in odds of, you mentioned like knowledge hoarding and other things that universities do through research. How can researchers support Landback?
It's a great ending question. Thank you.
So I think the first thing you'd want to do is just go to that tribal community and ask them, what do you need? What would help you? Incorporating indigenous research methodologies and indigenous critical race theory into your research, I believe would be incredibly helpful. Your research should benefit the community. If it's not benefiting the community, why are you doing it? Is it to benefit yourself and your own research? That's incredibly selfish. You want to use this population as lab rats and then publish a paper, increase your CV, and maybe get a professor emeritus status or whatever. I don't know much about academia. But again, ask them, what would help you? For example, when I was doing my master's degree, it was on bettering the education and place-based culturally relevant education of Northwest Maidu in my area. And I asked a few elders, I'm got to create some deliverables. I can't just say I talked to y'all. What do you want? What do you need? And they're like, well, we have our oral history that says that certain oak trees produce better acorn crops and they're fatter or they're longer. And we just have this oral history and it'd be really cool. Can you map it? I know you know a little bit about computers. Like, oh yeah, I can use ArcGIS or Avenza Maps and I can map them out for you. And then I can, since this is benefiting you, I'll just say that to respect self-determination, sovereignty, and your intellectual knowledge and property, it isn't available for any academics or students to see. I'll just write, it's censored, it's for them. If you don't believe me that it exists, just ask them. So I made the map, I gave it to them, and I was like, this is for the benefit of you. It really shouldn't be me worrying about, oh, I got to make some fancy cool thing that everyone's able to look at.
I think that's a great answer. And I just want to add, I think researchers are integral to to seeing this forward, because the social capital we're dealing with is knowledge, right? And so researchers are at the forefront. And I think that that's an example of how great problem solving can work too. Oh, we're solving this problem, but we also understand the system and how we can work around it. So I think that research is key to this, but it's also, again, I'm like a broken record. It's like indigenizing and shifting the narrative on how we talk about research, because we're not talking hierarchical, we're talking relational. And so if we shift your idea of what the research is for and who it serves, it doesn't serve the institution, it serves the communities that you're working with. That is huge because it opens so many doors. And I also just want to plug, I think that there's a piece that researchers are not seeing, but Megan Bang wrote a great article, and others for in an environmental education journal called Tobacco in the Streets. Muskrat Stories, Tobacco in the Streets, Living Chicago as an Indigenous Land. And the whole article is about asking educators to actually see Indigenous land wherever you are, and that it hasn't gone away just because there's concrete and whatever, that it's actually an environment. And I think that's another great example of like shifting that script for researchers in looking at, like, instead of talking about it in the confines of how academia generally has. So.
And I would just add really quick, this idea of owning something, owning a curriculum, owning kind of as what Hila said, but just every time someone approaches me to work, even on the land transfers, and they want to do the research, I'm like, you will not own it. And it's interesting, I haven't had anyone come back. But we don't own it. We don't own this process. We don't own the knowledge. We share it. We participated with Mechoopda. And so that's really hard for higher ed to wrap their heads around, right, is this idea of owning that knowledge. Whereas we come from the stance in our department, in my office, is we don't own it. We are a part of it. We're lucky to be sitting next to them.
Thank you so much. And yep, thank you all for your answers. Okay, our next panel will start in 5 minutes. So we do a 5-minute break and then we'll see you soon. Thank you.